Sound of Design
with Mark
and Dan. And thank you very much for joining us on today's episode. I am very excited because we get to talk all about subwoofers.
Subwoofers.
Woofs. Yeah, that's an Audio Quest joke for those of you who don't know.
Yeah. I keep forgetting.
Oh, that's phenomenal. It's one of the parts of the system that I think most people have had so much bad information that for so long, it's like, is there a more misunderstood part of a system? And when I say this, it's not actually by the average consumer. It's not actually by the everyday person. Most people understand what a subwoofer is, and they understand the bass and the sound, and they're down with it. But technical guys, for some reason, it's like they go off on these weird tangents, and you're going, man, like I don't. So anyway, I think today's going to be a lot of fun, and we may even ruffle some feathers, which I think would be very good. So
we might. We'll see.
I hope so. So let's jump right into it, and we're going to talk just real basically about the difference between a subwoofer and the rest of the speakers that you would see. And so, Mark, maybe just tell us a little bit about subs, on a high level, and we'll go from there.
Sure. So a subwoofer is the speaker that most people think as the really loud, boomy, maybe I don't need this speaker. And we're here to tell you that, yes, it can be loud. Yes, it might even be boomy, but you do need it. It is the speaker that plays back your lower frequencies. So when you're listening to music or watching movies, that's where you're going to get a lot of those low end frequencies. A lot of folks think that, oh man, I like I said, I don't need this. But in a lot of cases, again, like Dan said at the beginning, they're a little misinformed. I don't want to go too far into it yet, but really, I guess, yeah, it's going to play your low frequencies, right?
Yep. All about that bass.
Yep.
All about the bass.
All about that bass.
I think it's probably best to maybe frame or put in context a little bit. This whole concept is about about changes in air pressure. So when you think about a projector system, and we've talked about this before, right? You've got a screen and you've got a projector and you got to take the light in the room into consideration. This is the same kind of an idea, just applied specifically to bass frequencies. The room and the pressurization of that room really is a big part of how you're going to think about the bass and how you're going to think about the system in general. And it's true that there's a lot of folks who'll say, that I don't need or don't want this speaker because I don't like it when it's real boomy. And the reason for this, I think intuitively should make sense. Well, they've experienced it incorrectly because there's too much pressure, which in turn is uncomfortable. Nobody wants to be uncomfortable. So if you do it correctly, it's not going to overpower. It's not going to, overpressurize unless that's what you're into. And bass heads, I mean, listen, I love you and that's great.
Yep.
But that's not most. Okay. So using those guys as the exception, most people just want to have what we would call a full range sound. And that just means you can hear for the lowest frequencies, right? 20 hertz, 30 hertz, 35 hertz, and all the way up to, right, that 17, 18, 20,000, depending on what it is that your ears will actually pick up on. So,
for sure.
And even the stuff beyond it. So,
yeah.
All right.
And I was going to add, like, we've all been to that house party or ridden in a car with someone and they've got the sub or the bass turned all the way up and it's literally rattling your brain inside your skull. Like, that's cool and all, but like you were saying, I think that's an incorrect way for the average consumer to listen to bass.
Yeah. And again, I think it's really important that we kind of go through why that is and not just say, well, that's not cool, man, or that's uncomfortable, but I think we're going to kind of deep dive that. So there's two categories, right, that we will think of for subwoofers specifically, and that's active and passive. So could you maybe walk us down that road a little bit, Mark? And,
sure. Let's take a walk. So an active subwoofer is one that has an amplifier already built in, and by and large, that is the subwoofer that in a home audio environment that most people have had experience with or will experience. So there's a low voltage, essentially what you would consider an RCA cable, a single RCA cable that's connected from your preamp or receiver. It goes out to this and a connection on the subwoofer, typically labeled LFE, and then that goes into the amplifier inside of the box, which then powers that one speaker or multiple speakers, depending on what's in that subwoofer enclosure. Passive is essentially just like any other passive speaker that you would have, a bookshelf speaker, an in-wall speaker, but typically has larger drivers, different crossovers, and they're designed to be powered by an outboard amplifier, something that's typically quite a bit more power than what you would get inside of an active subwoofer. I know there are a couple out there that do a lot of power, but typically, like most subwoofer amps that we sell, are going to start at close to 800 to 1,000 watts. So you can move a lot more air with an in-wall subwoofer, or a passive subwoofer, I should say. A lot of them are in-wall, than you typically can with most active subwoofers.
Yeah, and I think the word typical is going to be key, right? So as with all things, there's huge levels of performance variation that's out there. And so when you're talking about the world of subwoofers, there is no one size fits all kind of an approach. It is really custom. You want to think through your room. You want to think through where it's going to be placed. And there are some cases where you have really a good design and a good aesthetic, a really, clean lines and things like that. And putting a big box, over in a corner just looks terrible, right? It might be white walls or something along those lines, or a cream or something like that. So the colors don't quite make sense, and so on and so forth. Or conversely, it might be a dedicated theater and those speakers look fantastic sitting out. And so you can't say that it's this or that. It really does need to be, well, let's take a look at the room and then let's figure out kind of what the design is.
Sure.
And I love the fact that you mentioned that you typically get more power when you do an in-wall sub, because I think that's the other thing that maybe 15 or 20 years ago was probably the reverse. An in-wall sub probably didn't sound as good, right? Definitely not better than a traditional box subwoofer. And so I think now we're in a place that's completely different because so many more people have liked the idea, and that's been so much more, especially in, high-end residential. That's been the go-to, is the in-wall sub, right? Because of the aesthetic and because of the look. And people want the performance. It's like, I don't want to compromise. I want the best of everything.
For sure.
So let's talk a little bit about some of the differences in the size of the drivers themselves, because as we know, subwoofers, typically speaking, are going to be pretty large. We see this all the time, and if you've ever been to the orchestra, you kind of know this, right? Or could imagine an orchestra. You sort of intuitively know, like, violin's a small-bodied instrument. It's going to make a small sound. Violas are a little bigger. Cello's even bigger. They're going to have a fuller sound. And then you get to that big double bass, and you're realizing, like, oh, my goodness, that thing is huge. So, like, what's going on there, when it comes to subwoofers? Because it looks like there's kind of a similar principle at play.
Sure. So, a lot of the subwoofers that we traditionally have worked with typically start in that 6 or 8 inch range. And then they'll kind of go up typically in 2 to 3 inch intervals, all the way up to 16, and then some of the DIY subs and some of the really out there subs are going to be larger than that. Well, why would I have a larger driver? Well, it's because I need to be able to get to those lower frequencies, and having more surface area on the driver gives it the ability to move more, which means it's capable of playing back those lower frequencies. So a 6-inch subwoofer or an 8-inch subwoofer, typically we would pair with, you may pair it with a floor standing speaker side by side to give it a little bit of extra oomph out of it. Whereas a larger 10, 12, 15, you may utilize 1 or 2 or 4 or however many of them that you need to give you to move a lot of air and really give you that low energy in your space if you're the type of person that likes to feel those movies. So to go back to what you were saying, your 6-inch is going to output bass, but it might not be able to get to those, between 20 and 30. It may only drop down to about 28 hertz. The larger subwoofers can get down to sub 20 hertz in some cases, which even if you're not hearing it, you may be feeling it, if that makes sense.
Yep. Absolutely. And so I think it's important to say that bigger is not necessarily better, but in a sense it is, right? I always tell people, it's like speaker manufacturers did not sit in a room and look at each other and say, what's the ugliest, biggest, grossest looking box that we can come up with and see if we can get people to buy it. It's like, no, there's a physics reason behind this, right? To piggyback off what you said, it's physics. Like, I need to move the air, and so that larger amount of surface area is going to be able to do it. Violin makers and the big double bass makers, they knew, right, hundreds of years ago, that you need that size in order to get there. I will say, though, that also means that you have to consider your application. So going back to it, if you don't want to feel it, okay, quite honestly, you might be better off with 2 8s or an 8 and a 10 or something along those lines. You may not necessarily want to go to a 15. It may not make sense in the size of the room. So again, don't make a sweeping statement and say, well, it's got to be this. It's like, well, I mean, that's great for some, but it may not be right for you. And so you just want to check with your designer, check with your integrator, and just make sure you're having that conversation. What type of bass experience do we expect from the performance of the system? And there's different ways that you can kind of design or put those drivers to use, and really kind of customize the way that they're going to output based upon what it is that you like. So if you want something that's boomier, or if you want something that's fuller, or you want something that's a little bit tighter, right? Those words are all adjectives to describe how you would kind of experience the bass in the room. So Mark, how would you describe some of the prevailing designs for how subwoofers are kind of put together, so that way we can really understand what some of that next level terms are going to be?
Sure.
So,
yeah. So typically, the size of the subwoofer kind of goes hand in hand with its design. And what I mean by design is we have a couple of different options. So the one that you typically see on a lot of your larger drivers, it's what's called a ported subwoofer. So what that means is that you'll have the driver inside of the cabinet, and the cabinet below or around or on the back or however it's designed is going to have one or multiple airflow spaces for air to be moved out of the woofer. So when I say moving air, you could stand in front of some of the bigger ones and literally your pant leg will move as it plays back because the driver is moving so much. It's pushing that much air out. You typically see these in a lot of movie theaters and other things like that because you need to move so much air and pressurize the space. The downside to a ported sub is sometimes it may not be as detailed as the next iteration, which is a sealed box subwoofer. Typically smaller cabinet or smaller driver size, maybe a smaller cabinet as well to pair with it. But those sealed cabinet subwoofers, yes, they're moving air, but they're typically going to give you a little bit more detail because they're not worried about moving so much air through and out of the cabinet. A lot of people would describe that as like a tighter base. And then you have Isobaric subwoofers, which, you know, when I first learned about it was like we called them kind of like force canceling subwoofers or something along those lines. And the best example that most people could go see today if they walk into any electronic space is the Sonos subwoofer. So you typically have multiple drivers that are either facing each other or facing away from each other that the way it's designed cancel out any vibrations in between them. So you kind of get, I would say, the best of both worlds, so to speak. It's going to move quite a bit more air because you have double the surface area. It's going to output a lot more because you have the multiple drivers, but you typically have a smaller cabinet. So you kind of get the best of both worlds there.
Yep. Absolutely. And honestly, the first time I listened to a force canceling or an isobaric design, it was kind of like a watershed moment, going like, oh, finally, here's a sub that does everything that I wanted to do and really sounds good. And my favorite demo, you brought up the Sonos, so I'll jump on it, on the bandwagon for a second. The demo was you put a nickel, right, on its side and you put it on top of the sub and then you play whatever demo or whatever it is. And the nickel just stays completely still. I mean, it's unbelievable. You would think, you know, with all that air and with all that volume and all the power and all the things, that it would be rattling all over the place. And it just doesn't. It was completely stable, and it would sit on its side for the entire demo, 3 minutes. It wouldn't fall, you know, unless somebody came over and knocked it. Like, it was really, really an incredible demo. And an incredible testament to that specific design.
For sure. Because the other option that we heard, you know, the Sonos sub came out, and then I know you and I, that was kind of probably our first real experience with it. And then we went, you know, when we moved to where we are now, and we heard the Martin Logan Balance Force 212.
Oh my goodness.
Wow. You know, now this thing's a coffee table that sits next to you essentially. But it's an incredible subwoofer and has an even more incredible demo built into it that we still use to this day. It's so much fun. There's a tone sweep built into it, so you can actually isolate specific frequencies and vibrations in the room when you're calibrating it. But essentially, when you hit it, it'll just continuously do that.
Yep.
And we'll get it to a point where it'll vibrate literally everything in the room, but the cabinet itself really isn't vibrating at all. So it's pretty incredible considering how much air that thing is moving.
Yeah, and I mean, it's got a ton of power, right? So more than 1,500 watts. It's going to be, you know, extremely rigid in terms of the driver material. And as a result, like, there's just no compromise, you know. And of course, it goes back to this concept of, you know, like, design appropriately to your room. If you've got a big open concept, right, and it's open to, you know, living room, dining room, kitchen, office, and, you know, you don't have a lot of doors, and before you know it, you start looking at the design, you're going to say, like, we're not just pressurizing a 200 square foot space. Like, we're actually pressurizing a much larger space. It might actually be 1,000 square feet or 1,500 square feet or something like that. So you put a sealed sub in that kind of an environment, and you may notice it, but you may not at the exact same time. And we had this happen not too long ago. There was a client that did 2 subs, both of them sealed. And this is exactly the scenario, right? Big open concept, all this kind of stuff. And you could walk around that room, and we had it turned all the way up. We had the crossovers on. We did everything we could, and you just couldn't hear it. It just got lost and swallowed up in the room for a million different reasons. And as soon as we switched the position of one of them, it was like, oh, there's the bass. Well, why? Well, because we were getting a reflection off of the back window that hit now finally where it wasn't being canceled out, and the wasn't being, you know, the pressurization wasn't being sucked away into this other part of the house, right? And so it's like, you have to think through a little bit about where where you're ultimately going to put that that speaker, and that client ultimately ended up going to a balance force. It was unbelievable. But at the end of the day, that's what's necessary in order to pressurize that big of a space, right?
Mm-hmm. Sure. And then the other one, I know we kind of got carried away on Isobaric, but you also have, some in-ceiling options, in-wall and in-ceiling options that are kind of, I would probably describe as kind of a ported sealed hybrid.
Yeah.
And then you don't typically see them, utilized in home theater spaces. They're typically more utilized for music distribution throughout the house for better bass transmission around your home.
Yeah, and I think it's fair because it depends on the type that you get. So if you just cut your speaker right into drywall, then you think about what type of cabinet or enclosure there is for that speaker, and it's really a stud bay and some drywall. And that's not really going to do a ton there in terms of dealing with that negative energy. Although they are designed for that environment, and there's great engineering that goes into them, so they sound good, even like that. But in the higher end models, you'll almost always see some variation of a pre-construction back box. So if you're building a home and you want to go for this look, then all day, every day, pick something up early during the pre-wire phase, get those enclosures, get those back boxes into your stud bays, so that way you have the ability to just pop the speaker in at the very last second, and your drywall is done, it's been painted, it's clean, everything's essentially good to go. And those back boxes make a big difference in terms of the way that they're ultimately going to sound. Wasn't there one from Bowers and Wilkins? I think that I don't know if it's still an active model or not. That was like an in cabinet too, if I remember. Yeah,
it was size W3, I think.
Yep, that's right. That sounds right.
It was I think it's still made, but I actually got to hear it when I went and visited them years ago. But it's really designed to be either in a cabinet or in the floor or truss of the floor below you. So it has a cabinet itself that you typically put inside of a cabinet, or like I said, in the floor or something along those lines, and then a vent piece that you could vent into the space, so it would move a lot of air, but you could hide it in a cabinet or typically in the floor, which is the way that I've utilized it. So you can have this vent that comes up through the floor, and then get a matching floor vent, just the same that you would use for your HVAC, and the subwoofers disappeared completely. It just looks like it's an HVAC vent that's in your floor, but it's a subwoofer. And awesome. It's a passive sub, like it needs, that additional amplification, and but it's impressive. And when it comes to design, that is one that's preferred by a lot of folks because you don't have to see it.
Yep. Well, and you triggered something in my brain, which is if you put subwoofers outside, doing a passive subwoofer with the amplifier that lives inside is almost always going to be the case, right? Because you can't have those electronics exposed to the elements, but you can have a sealed, and you can have a phenomenal sub. And so I know Martin Logan makes them, Sonance makes them, almost all the outdoor manufacturers, JBL makes them. They have dedicated subwoofers that are passive. They go out into your landscape and, again, run off that amplifier that lives in the rack or lives inside the house somewhere. So it really you can put a subwoofer pretty much wherever you want to. There's kind of no limits anymore.
For sure.
So, let's kind of shift gears a little bit. Let's go back to active subs, right, where the amplifier is built in. And let's kind of talk a little bit about some of the knobs that are on the back. I've seen on a bunch of them, you'll have what's called a crossover. You'll see typically phase. Sometimes there'll be switches that'll be for placement and things like that. So let's just tackle crossover first. Can you just explain what it is and kind of what its purpose is, and then maybe we can jump off from there?
Sure. So the crossover is designed to essentially set what frequencies you want the subwoofer to play back. Now, we'll talk about this as far as what the knob's going to do first, but there are some other variables that you need to take into account. So, but what that knob will allow you to do is, let's say you have a pair of KEF R11s. Those speakers can get pretty low as far as their frequency response. So you might set the crossover on your subwoofer to start where those speakers end. So typically you would say, I mean, and those speakers can drop to 40 hertz, but we'd probably have it at 80 hertz. And that's typically where most crossovers start anyway on a subwoofer. But let's say I'm the type of person that likes a little bit more of the mid bass coming out of my subwoofer. I can adjust the knob to go to 120. And that means anything 120 hertz and below, my subwoofer is going to play back. Any frequencies that it receives above 120 hertz, it is not going to play. And typically those knobs will go up to 220, 240. You typically don't see folks get to those higher frequencies unless they're using in-ceiling speakers that are typically lower quality. Yeah, because they're not really designed to play a lot of bass at all. So you really need the subwoofer to kind of make up for those. Now, that being said, most of the time that knob does not work.
What do you mean it doesn't work, Mark?
So because
I can turn it, right?
You can turn it. So, but it's not actually doing anything. And the reason being is that in a traditional setup with surround sound, the AV receiver has already set up the frequencies that are going to the sub, and the connection that is labeled LFE on the back of the sub that you're utilizing bypasses the crossover built into the sub and is only taking whatever frequencies the receiver's already sending it. So you would actually, if you wanted higher frequencies, go to the receiver and set the frequency a little bit higher there.
Yep. And this is where I think, you have to really think about the position and where you are in line. So if you have a receiver that's generating the signal, right, off of whatever movie, video game, TV show, whatever it is that you're watching, music that you're listening to, and then it goes out of the receiver into the sub, well, then, of course, whatever the receiver says, the sub has to do. So I think once you sort of think through it for a second, you go, oh, okay, yeah, it makes sense. Let me go into the receiver. Let me go check my crossovers inside those settings and see where they're set to. And then you can go in and dial in where the sub would be. And sometimes, I've done this a lot of times where you'll quite honestly set the receiver to 80 hertz or something along those lines, and then go back in, you'll set the receiver to say 120, but then you'll set the crossover again a little bit, not necessarily matching that point, but you might dial it to, like, say 110 or something along those lines. And if you have two subwoofers, you can do all sorts of really cool things. So certain subwoofers are going to play just certain frequencies and things like that. So
Yep. And also, the other reason the crossover would be utilized, and it's typically where we use it the most, is when you are utilizing multiple subwoofers. And instead of using the low LFE output, you're utilizing a pre-output from the AV receiver or processor, which then essentially is sending a full range signal that you can then adapt to each speaker. The perfect system, which we probably should have mentioned earlier, would be to have a subwoofer for every speaker, and not a big boomy subwoofer, but something like a smaller 6 or 8 inch sub, even, that's just going to help that speaker be able to get the most out of what you're listening to. I say that speaker, but just kind of help make up for what that speaker that you're using is not giving you. But the pre-out would allow us to then fully utilize the crossover and on each subwoofer per each speaker, and not to go too far down that rabbit hole, but that's the real reason you would utilize that.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you called it out, because, I think of companies that have built-in active subwoofers into their tower lineups, like Definitive Technology. And, there's plenty of folks who have done that over the years. I think Mirage made some, if I remember correctly, as well. And I know Martin Logan has some with their electrostatics. They'll have active subwoofers built in as well. And you start realizing that as the speakers get nicer and nicer, that the necessity for full range, that lowest frequency to the highest frequency, that lowest bass sound to the highest treble sound, that has to be incorporated in some way, shape, or form. And so, of course, it makes sense that every speaker should be able to play back all of the sounds. It's kind of weird when you think about it for a second that they don't. But if you were to take a book seriously, right, you would say, well, you designed a speaker and it can't do certain things. It's like, well, we were limited in terms of our physics, right, and what we were able to accomplish. And so bookshelf speakers notoriously, right, don't have a lot of bass. Satellite speakers, a 4-inch woofer and a 2-inch tweeter or 1-inch tweeter. Sometimes satellites with that, like 3.5, I've seen even. They're just not going to be able to produce those low frequencies, and so you got to find some way, right, to get the bass out of that channel. So,
yeah, for sure.
All right. So one of the things that I would also mention is phase and some of the other settings. Why would you want to adjust the phase, and what are you doing when you adjust that?
Yeah. Phase is typically utilized, or is not typically, is utilized when you have multiple subwoofers located in the same room. Now, why would I want to do this? So let's say I put 2 subwoofers on the same wall in front of me, or subwoofer in the front left and the rear right. And I start playing my movie. What will typically happen if you're in the sweet spot directly, especially directly in the center of them, is you're probably not going to hear anything. Why is that? Because they're actually canceling each other out, because the wavelengths are hitting at the same time, allowing them to cancel the sound out, right? Since we talked about it in Mac, when we talked about Macintosh a long time ago, how they actually flip something out of phase to and then flip the signal back into phase to eliminate the noise. Well, if your woofers are in or out of phase together, or in phase, you actually will lose the signal to your ear. You just won't hear it. So by adjusting that knob on the back to, typically it goes to 180, you're flipping it out of phase, meaning those wavelengths are going to be opposite of each other and they won't be canceling each other out.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of like a good visual, which is like I've got a positive bass frequency in the middle from the front, and I've got a negative bass frequency from the sub in the back, and they're both at the hitting at the exact same physical space, right? That same moment in time, and again, that's where that cancellation is occurring. It's almost it's not inevitable, but it's so common in a lot of rooms for you to hear this, and it doesn't necessarily have to be from a second sub. It could just be from a solid back wall or side wall or something along those lines, where you've got this perfect reflection, where you've designed a really nice, beautiful room, and so you haven't put up any art. There's nothing in the back. There's no bar. There's no nothing. And so it's just a flat wall. Well, the sub hits it, bounces back on itself, and before you know it, you've lost, the bass in certain sections of the room. And so you could sit in the middle seat, and maybe you got it set it so that way it sounds great there. But then you sit 1 foot over the seat right next to you, you don't hear anything, and you're going like, "Hey, where'd my bass go?"
Yep.
Like, this is really crazy, right? But this is, I think, just due to the fact that pressurization and those bass frequencies are a lot longer. They're taller. They're wider. However you want to think about it, there's more energy to them, and so you just start to notice a lot more when things are not right. So because they haven't been set up or dialed in.
And I'm glad you brought up the kind of the description of the room where the subwoofer, frequency bouncing off the wall can cause those same issues, because that actually used to happen in our old showroom, in our premium room. We had a $120,000 stereo set up, and you couldn't hear the bass. You could not hear the bass from it, because the room was built 2 feet too short and width. So the frequencies were actually canceling each other out. And the only way you could really hear the bass was to either pull the sub way out into the room or go stand in a corner. You stood in a corner and you'd be, I mentioned, your brain rattling inside your head. That would be happening because we would have to kind of try to overcompensate for the bad design of the room that we're in.
Yeah, 1,000%. And to this day, I think it's one of those things where it's kind of difficult for you to give a good demo in certain spaces because there are some physical limitations. And it doesn't mean that you're not going to be able to do it. Sometimes just a quick, shift of the position of that driver will be enough for you to actually hear what's going on. And that means that you're turning it 90 degrees or, maybe you're turning it 45 degrees or something like that. And you walk around the room and I routinely will tell folks like, okay, hold on, let me dial it in real fast and we'll get it positioned. I'll walk around, I'll find where the sub's hitting and I'm like, all right, come stand over here. I know this is weird. We don't have to, we just have to do this for the purposes of the demo. When we come and do the installation, our guys are going to be able to do this and they'll be able to sit down and we'll calibrate. We'll make sure that it's dialed in for where you sit and make sure that we have good, even coverage, right? So, well, it takes us back to this concept of placement. So, is there any rule of thumb that you could maybe talk about that would help us in thinking about where to put a sub in a room?
Yeah. So a lot of people, when we go back to the beginning of our conversation, how they think that the subwoofer is ugly. So they want to try to place it wherever they don't have to see it. And if that's really what you want, we need to talk about a different subwoofer with your designer or integrator that you're utilizing. Because that's probably not the best place to put it, which is right in the corner. Typically. The best place to put a subwoofer is to take a full measurement of the wall that it's on. So take that and then divide that into thirds or fifths. Thirds being, in my experience, a little bit better, but you can do either or. But what that allows you to do is kind of get the proper placement of the subwoofer in the space to where it kind of can breathe off of a wall. And those wavelengths from a subwoofer are typically a lot larger and take a little bit longer to do a full wavelength. So by having them a little bit off the wall, you do allow for that frequency to fully get a full wavelength and not get improper reflections off the wall or into the room.
Yep, absolutely. And I understand not everybody's going to have the physical space if it's in a living room or something along those lines. And so this is one of those reasons why, going back to it, why you're going to utilize some variation on calibration software. We just did a Dirac calibration for a client, and it was unbelievable how much more accurate the timing was after we ran that calibration. And we didn't have an ideal room even close. I mean, it was a really, really, really problematic space in terms of getting accuracy from the speakers and from the subwoofer. But when we did that calibration, the bass management was just night and day different. It was clean, it was tight, and the subwoofer position really honestly didn't move. It was all done in the software. So it was pretty amazing that we were able to do that without getting the ideal position. So it's not something that necessarily has to be done every time, but it's something that I would highly, highly recommend having just heard it so clearly and so starkly. Make sure that you're calibrating that subwoofer, so that way the placement is less of an issue.
Agreed.
So let's jump into then I think where a lot of people maybe start their thought process, but now we've kind of saved it towards the end, I think, for the right reasons. Because now that you have kind of a layout of how they work and what they are and those kinds of things, I answer this question: how many subwoofers should I get, and why?
Well, it's going to be all dependent on your space, but I would at minimum recommend 2 for movies. And that's because two subwoofers can do more work than one. Even if those two aren't necessarily as good as a one that you could purchase at the same budget amount. An example I would give is a subwoofer that I've sold, an iteration of a subwoofer I've sold for 15 years, is the Dynamo 800 from Martin Logan. It's $850 subwoofer. Typically would do two of those compared to one Dynamo 1100, 11-inch driver, not 11-inch. Good Lord, it's a day. It's just Dynamo 1100. You've got that bigger cabinet. Dynamo 800 times 2 means I don't have to make them work as hard in order to fill that space. Whereas the Dynamo 1100, I might have to turn it up to 80 or 90% and ask it to really work to fill my space. If I put the Dynamo 800 in the front and another one in the rear corner, adjust the phase like we discussed earlier, you're going to get better bass coverage across that space. And then you can add more, which is where it gets to be a lot of fun. When we were talking earlier, we were talking about having a individual subwoofer per speaker. That is the perfect scenario. How many times have you done that though, Dan?
I have yet to do that, Mark.
Okay. Yeah, I have yet to do it either. I have done a center channel woofer with two LFEs, but that's about as far as you get. And it's because in most cases we either run out of budget or run out of aesthetically what we're allowed to or able to do, right?
I'll caveat that with I have done a system with probably the most we did on a per channel basis is when we used some definitive technology towers, and the client had two existing front towers. We added an active sub driven center channel. We had two sides that were towers. We had two rears that were towers. Again, those all had active subwoofers built in. And then we had two LFE channels in that space as well. The only speakers that didn't have subs were the in-ceiling ones that we used for the Atmos channels. And so I can't say that we had every single speaker, but we had most of them. And it's still to this day one of the best sounding rooms that I've ever heard. I mean, and it wasn't the most expensive, by the way. It had nothing. It was nothing to do with the price. It wasn't nothing. Don't hear that wrong. But we did not blow the budget out in that room. We were actually very conservative, all things considered, and It was awesome.
Sure. And just to correct myself, because sometimes my brain is so full of knowledge that I just speak out of turn. That subwoofer is a 12-inch subwoofer, not an 11. And I apologize for any of my Martin Logan friends who are listening to this. I promise I still love your products. But really, that's the 800 are 210s. The 1100's a 12. The 210s are going to do more or do better work than 112. That's the easiest way to explain it.
Yeah, and I think that concept goes back to headroom, right? So it's kind of this intuitive principle, and it's true across the board for stereo and quite honestly for any tool. And you could apply this to cars, you could apply this to your computer, you could apply this to anything. If I ask something to work at its full capacity, it's gonna break down and burn out. And I think we all kind of know that. That's true for us as human beings. So I don't understand why looking at this tool, this subwoofer concept, it would be any different. If I can get two working, that's going to be a lot more efficient than one maxed out. And so that's really the way you have to think about it. So I agree with you 1,000%. What if I was doing a stereo and I wanted to just listen to music? I want to recreate a recording studio style environment. I'm maybe kind of listening room or something along those lines. How many subs would you put in that scenario, and how would that change?
It's going to be dependent again on the space. But typically I would do one to two sealed subwoofers, because with music, I'm typically looking for that tighter bass compared to trying to move a lot of air, unless you're the type of person that likes a little bit more boomy bass, depending on the music that you're listening to. If I'm listening to, some classical music and I really want to get the tightness of each of those bass drum hits, but also be able to get all the correct frequency playback from all of the instrumentation across the orchestra, I don't want big boomy. I just want something that I can feel when it's there, but is also giving me the good sounds of the cellos and the saxophones and the violins and all of the other things that I'd be listening to.
Yep, absolutely. And I will say too that in the most amazing systems, and one of the ones that we heard not too long ago featured 6 subwoofers for a stereo system.
Yep.
Was one of the most eye-opening listening experiences I've had in a long time, because they were showing during this demonstration the ability to produce height in terms of the sound stage that was possible. And so I really do think that we've been putting subwoofers, quite frankly, on the floor and in the corners for too long. And it's probably time for us to move them into the room and probably, quite frankly, raise them up. Because when I heard the subwoofers on the highest level being played, the stage was massive. And I mean, it makes sense. If you go to a concert, you go someplace else, you're gonna see that kind of happening naturally. But to see that in an enclosed space and in a critical listening environment just absolutely opened up the entire system. And as they went through that demo, they turned off the top layer and then the mid layer, and you could kind of feel the whole room just kind of drop. Like the whole thing just came right down. Still sounded very clean, still sounded clear. We still heard all the right notes, but our sense of stereo image was kind of lost. And so, when you think about the best way, again, going back to it, the surround sound room, I want a sub for every channel. I also think in a stereo environment that you should have subs in proportion to the size or height of the sound that you're trying to reproduce as well. And that's going to give you the ability to enjoy that experience even more, because now I'm getting not just full range, but I'm also getting an accurate image, right? So it really does, if you can figure out a way to get a demo of it, unbelievably impactful.
Yeah, and those were rail number 32s, right?
They were.
I want to say they were. Yeah,
32s.
Yeah.
Very, very good subs.
Yes.
Understatement of the year. Very good subs.
but that, just to plug rail there for a second, it's something that they do across most of their model lineup. So you don't have to buy a $10,000 a piece subwoofer like we got to listen to.
Right.
You could drop down to, $1,000-$1,500 per subwoofer, and double or triple stack them. Even their home theater series and the Predator, the HT1510 Predator, that thing, triple stacked will blow your mind, and $6,000 for 3.
Yep.
If you do a pair of stacks, you're at $12,000. But it's something that I literally last week just had a client that said, I want, the most awesome subwoofer experience I can get. And I'm like, well, cool. $6,000. We need to do 3 of these. They're like, oh, my budget's 2. Okay, well, let's start with 1. And then in a few months, you come back and we can add another one. And then we can add another one on top of that. And it allows you to grow with your system.
Yep. And I love the fact you mentioned it that way, because this is one of those kind of unsung concepts, which is that upgrade over time, right? And we've talked about the upgrades kind of strategies in the past, but that second sub or a third sub really is one of those things that allows you to bring your system back to life. If you've bought something and you put in a nice system, 3 or 4 years ago, and you're starting to get the itch a little bit, how can I upgrade? What's a spot that I could, really invest some money into and not compromise what I already have, right? But build on top of that and really take it to the next level. Well, the subwoofers are a phenomenal place, quite honestly, to invest, because you never lose on their performance. It's not like you get diminishing returns. Every time you add one, you're adding a lot more power, right? And you're adding a lot more sense of life and space and dimensionality that was just not there before because the system wasn't capable of reproducing it. So if you want that impact, I mean, it's a great way to upgrade a system. Great way to upgrade a system. So, all right. What else should we touch on for subs, Mark? Let's make sure we didn't miss anything.
I mean, I think the one thing that we've kind of tried to talk about here is you definitely need it. You know, it's no matter what experience you're looking for, even the folks that do say, "Oh, I don't need that. I don't like the big bang boom boomy sounds," they're gonna miss it. And it's something that if you find the right subwoofer and the right placement and you work with someone who is knowledgeable around this, we can get you the right performance and the right aesthetic for you, so you're not missing out on, you know, what you're paying for, which is usually to get, you know, some sort of cinematic or great stereo experience. And without the subwoofer, you're just not getting it.
Yeah. Well, all right. And listen, I agree with you 1,000%, obviously. So what is your favorite one or two, if you've got more than that, I'm sure you do, but sub demos? What do you use when you're trying to show off what a subwoofer can do?
That's It, I'm Crazy by Sophie Tucker.
Yep.
That's not the actual name of the song, but that's the radio version of the song
that you're allowed to listen to and phrase.
Yep. Just to try to keep this as PG as possible. The other one was it Bass Nectar? Was that the one? I'm trying to think of the name of the artist.
Yeah.
It's
Unlimited.
Yep.
Yeah. Hold on. I'll find it real quick. Let me see if I can find that. Oh my goodness. I had it saved for that reason.
It's on Unlimited, but it's I've got it here. Reaching out.
That
was it. Yep.
Very good. Great one. An absolute great one.
Another Dan that showed us that a long time ago, or at least played that for me the first time.
Good dude. I need to reach out to him.
Yep.
If you're listening, what's up, man?
Yep. Well, those are two big boomy ones. 1812 Overture is one of my favorite ones for an orchestral demo. If we're talking about tight bass, you know, the big bass drum hits and the you know, kind of climax of that orchestration.
Yeah, I mean, there's something so satisfying too when you hear a great orchestral work played, you know, quite honestly, at a loud volume. I don't know, you know, we have this impression of orchestral pieces that, you know, it's quiet and it's soft and it's delicate. And it's like, you know, when you get into it, you know, you listen to some of the great composers and they've got fireworks all over the place. And you need a system that's capable of reproducing everything that's actually going on for you to get the full effect of what you're listening to. So. For
sure. And the dynamic range is unmatched, I would say. I mean, you can bring up some of the great vocalists that are out there. And while those are great, there's nothing, in my opinion, that matches the dynamic range of a well-recorded orchestra.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I want to throw out one just as an honorable mention too, which is Dilemma by Lewis and the Yakuza. And they're based out of France, and they do hip hop. And when their sub hits hit, they are truly incredible. And I have no idea if their language is clean because I don't speak French. So as long as you don't speak French, you're probably safe. So it's a really, really good one. All right. Well, awesome, man. Awesome. I would just want to say thank you very much for listening to The Sound of Design
with Mark
and Dan. Please like, comment, and subscribe, share with your friends, and we will see you guys on the next episode.
See ya.